the many of our viewers will watch this in the recording. So this is the third of a series of lectures that we started in 2021, devoted to celebrations of the Greek War of Independence. So for our members, if you remember, we had Richard Clogg at the very beginning talking to us about the diaspora and the Greek War of Independence. And then Sakis Gekas from York University in Canada talking to us about the veterans of the 1821 war. So today we're gathered here to hear who is probably the world expert on a dimension of the Greek War of Independence, which is really half of the population that experienced it, that very rarely gets to be represented, which is the perspective of the experiences of women during the war. So Eleni Angelomatis-Tsougarakis is Professor Emerita of the Department of History at Ionian University. Her expertise covers many aspects of modern Greek history, such as foreign travelers in Greece, Greek men of letters during the Ottoman period, the history of education, the history of women, and local histories in Crete and in Corfu. She has published 7 monographs. She has published 7 edited volumes and many, many other papers, over 70 papers in academic journals and edited manuscripts. It includes The Eve of the Greek Revival, British Travelers' Perceptions of Early 19th Century Greece, published in 1990, and Greece Before the War of Independence, 1821, The Birth of a National State, published in 2011. The topic of her lecture for the Hellenic University Club for us today is Fighters and Victims, Greek Women in the War of Greek Independence. And I will remind everyone to turn off your microphone during this talk so that we'll have the pleasure of seeing Professor Angelomatis-Tsougarakis in full view, and there won't be any kind of noise interruptions. So thank you for coming to Philadelphia remotely, and we look forward to hearing you now and hearing you again when we play the recording.
Well, I'm delighted. Thank you for the invitation. I'm honored with it, and I hope I won't disappoint you and disappoint the audience after all those good words you said about me. Anyway, let's start. Greek women's lives during the Greek Revolution are not very well documented. Official documents referring to them are comparatively few. Letters, memoirs, histories offer us fragmentary, partial, and very often subjective and second-hand information. In the past, and to a certain degree even until now, what has been written about them is not the product of serious research. The revolution affected the Greeks of various places, different and from far different length of time. Sometimes the revolution was very short because the Turks moved in. At other times, it lasted until there was an agreement. Anyway, women and children were equally affected, though in different ways and in varying degrees. Their lives, hard as they might have been previously, were usually overturned because destruction, loss of lives, enslavement, unbearable human suffering, and mass refugee movements prevailed. Since we don't have photos at that time, we have only the foreign travelers' drawings that give us a vague picture of the Greek women at the time. So let's have a look of what they presented. You see there are different dresses from different periods and from different places. And the following, that's a peasant woman of Athens. And you can still see this sort of dress were worn, as I was telling before, to Kostis, in women in near Megara, where they still have their ancestors' old dresses. That's a woman from Delphi and Thebes. Women of Mytilene, Lesbos, Mykonos, and Kassos. Women of Melos and of Constantinople, the lady, a Phanariot lady. Women of Tinos, Ioannina, and Corfu. Women and children of Chios and Sipnos. Greek women lived and functioned in the private sector, not in the public. Married women of the higher ranks of society, like some you can see here, usually had rather comfortable and sheltered lives, supervising the running of the household and the raising of their children. Some more. But they were seldom seen in public. They didn't go around. Although they might occasionally have the occasion to involve themselves in economic affairs. It was only the widows who, as head of their families, were legally more liberated and thus much more active in all social and economic life. Young girls were totally secluded until marriage. Marriage was a social obligation for the family and for both sexes. Not getting married and having children was also considered detrimental to the Greeks for demographical reasons. As an ecumenical patriarch, Samuel Hadzaris, had pronounced in the mid-18th century. Early betrothals were customary, so were marriages at very young ages. The legal age for marriage was 12 for the girls and 14 for the boys since Byzantine times, but men often married much later in life, causing the disapproval of the aforementioned patriarch. Dowries were essential for any marriage, and the families were obliged to provide them. It was different for the lower class women. You can see some brides. The bride's dresses are completely different from what we see nowadays or even 100 years ago. Stackelberg was in the early 19th century in Greece, Athens, and it's of that period, the bridal dress and headdress. And this is a picture of peasant wedding procession. I don't remember from which place it's taken. Now coming to the lower class women, it was usual for them to work along with their other family members as unpaid laborers or as hire agricultural laborers since very young. You can see here a family of shepherds in Arcadia with their children, without shoes, very primitive sort of life. And you can see here women of Larissa doing household chores. Women coming down from the Olympus mountain. You can see this one carrying wood and having spinning at the same time. Another one is carrying a barrel of water. Yeah. This is also in 1803 or 4, drawn by well. So the women took care of the household duties of raising their children or their younger siblings. In the towns, poor girls were usually servants, married women as wet nurses. On the islands and in mountainous areas, only women and elderly people carried out the agricultural and all other kinds of work, even building houses or whatever. Since most of the men were absent from their homes for long periods of time, working as sailors, carriers, traders, artisans, etc. Additionally, every stage of the production of clothing for the entire family was done by women. On some islands and in mountainous villages, there were also small or medium-scale private enterprises run by women, mostly in making clothes, stockings, gloves and caps, handkerchiefs, and various other things, such as sails and ropes. Education for girls was non-existent, except for those who belonged to families of scholars or to the higher ranks of society, like the Phanariote families. Contrary to this rather dismal and sad picture, Greek women had more legal rights than most European women at the same time. Not all of the present-day Greece was then under the Ottomans. On the other hand, a very large Greek population lived all over the Ottoman Empire outside of Greece, so the revolution directly or indirectly affected them as well. The Ionian Islands were then a British protectorate called the Ionian State, and the Ionian Greeks were the citizens of that state. As a great number of Ionian men left to join the revolution, and the Ionian merchant navy helped transporting men, food, ammunition to the fighting Greeks, the British imposed a very strict neutrality, stipulating severe punishment for offenders. Moreover, the Ionians were also affected by the influx of refugees from mainland Greece, whom they tried to help and support. The consequences of the war were very severe on all the Aegean islands. Some were totally destroyed. Cyprus and Crete suffered a great deal, and many of their inhabitants migrated to Greece. Other islands suffered for various reasons and to varying degrees from the expeditions of the Ottoman Navy, the results of the naval battles in their vicinity, occasional pirate attacks, internal strife between their Orthodox and Catholic communities, etc. Many of them faced a very serious refugee problem. People from Asia Minor, Crete, other Aegean islands, and mainland Greece sought shelter there. Often, the refugees were much greater in number than the local population of some small islands, which could hardly support them, barren and poor as they were, and with their commerce seriously or completely disrupted. Only in few of the small but richer islands, everyday life continued without many dramatic changes, but that was the exception. Since the revolution did not break out everywhere at the same time, as you may know, the first changes in women's lives started being felt gradually. When the news of the revolution in the Danubian principalities, up here, where present-day Romania and Moldavia is, and Transylvania over there, the revolution in the Danubian principalities became known, some distinguished Phanariote Greek families escaped from Constantinople to Russia just in time. Few managed to flee later, often without their families. Then, by the Sultan's order, the execution of the Patriarch and of the most important Phanariote officials followed, while the mob indiscriminately killed the Greeks of the city. Some of the noble Greek ladies were helped by the Russian consul to escape secretly on board Greek ships under Russian flag. Others were exiled along with their children to various towns of Asia Minor, while some others were kept imprisoned in their own houses. On the eve of the outbreak of the revolution in the Peloponnese, and immediately after, many local political leaders, chieftains, and some merchants moved their families to safer places, like the fortified monastery of Megaspilion in Calavrita near Agia Lavra, and in the castle of Kloboutsi in the western Peloponnese. Then, all these and many others were transferred to the Ionian Islands, where the men used to have commercial interests before, and some chieftains, for example, Kolokotronis, had lived there not long ago. As the war progressed, the number of refugee women and children in the Ionian Islands increased. They were not just from the Morea, the Peloponnese, but also from the Western Greece and Epirus. By mid-May 1821, 7,000 women and children had moved just to Janda. The refugee numbers increased for as long as the British allowed it, which was not always the case. Eventually, the small Ionian islands of Kalamos, near Lefkada, became officially a place where civilian refugees, women and children, and some elderly people were allowed to stay. At some point, their numbers there reached the 15,000. Many more refugees resided in the main Ionian Islands and were supported by the local inhabitants. Thrace, Macedonia, and Thessaly joined the revolution a little later in May 1821. They were at greater disadvantage than southern Greece because of the greater number of Turks living there with a considerable number of soldiers. They went through very hard times then, and they suffered substantial losses of their population due to the warfare, combined with large-scale massacres, enslavement, and the general flight to several regions. Arranging for women and children to move before the war reached their homes was not at all easy. Several Greek sources vividly describe what usually happened in most places. When the Turks, or later the Egyptian forces, approached the villages, panic-stricken women and children fled in a disorderly fashion and in an often futile attempt to search for shelter up on the mountains, in caves, and on precipitous heights. In the Morea, there were one or two places where very tall removable ladders had been made, which women used in order to climb up to very dangerous heights and hide in unapproachable caves. Often, rather than being captured, young girls and women holding their children committed suicide by throwing themselves off cliffs. Sometimes they managed to drag the enemy soldiers, holding them down with them. If they were pursued somewhere near the sea, a lake, or a river, they chose to jump in and drown. When they were on higher ground at the top of precipitous slopes, they dropped rocks and stones and whatever else was available on their pursuers, often managing to kill them. In towns and cities wherever there were foreign consulates, women and children turned to them for shelter. In several cases, the foreign consuls helped and protected them. In some others, however, they closed the doors to them. Foreign eyewitnesses described the courtyard of many European embassies in Constantinople as being so full of Greek people that their residents could hardly enter the mansions without stepping on them. The French consuls at Smyrna and in Patras rescued many Greek families. In contrast, the Turcophile British consul in Patras, Philip Green, sent away the terrified women and children seeking shelter in his consulate. Large and small-scale massacres generally followed this pattern. Men, older women, and babies were killed on the spot, but younger women, girls, and young boys were taken prisoners. In most cases, we don't know the exact numbers either of the dead or of the prisoners. The prisoners were sent to be sold in the slave markets all over the Ottoman Empire and in North Africa. Women generally believed that to become a slave was a worse fate than death. That's why they preferred to take their own lives and the lives of their children than being taken prisoners. Moreover, a quick death was always preferable to death by torture, which happened in some cases when women prisoners refused to convert to Islam. That was the phase of the wives of some leaders of the revolution in Naousa, in Macedonia, in 1822. When they refused to convert, they were tortured to death in Thessaloniki, in Salonika, where they were kept. Having to choose between slavery and conversion or death, the 13 girls of Naousa chose death and threw themselves down into the falls of the river, which you can see here, and a statue had been erased to remind the people visiting their fate. Women and children were driven from various places of Macedonia to Thessaloniki in a series of caravans to be sold in the slave market there. This scene is described by the French consul of that city, who witnessed it on May the 10th, 1822. Desperate women and children of Macedonia trespassed into the forbidden grounds of Mount Athos, seeking shelter there. That was the first time ever that women entered the Agion Oros in the 1,000 years history of it, where exclusively male monastic communities reside. The most tragic of all massacres was perhaps that of Chios, which shocked alike the Greeks and the people of Europe and America. Chios was the most prosperous island of Greece, with a population between 100,000 and 120,000 people. It had thriving commerce with branches in Constantinople, Leghorn, Trieste, and even London. It also had a famous school with an extensive library and a printing press. Between March and July 1822, this island was completely destroyed. In the end, only about 2,000 people remained alive there. Of course, some people managed to flee, and many others, merchants in particular, were absent at that time. According to various estimates, approximately 20,000 people were only saved. Those slaughtered you can visit it and see it when you go to Chios there, the ossuary. Those slaughtered have been between 30,000 and 42,000 people. Those who were taken as slaves were estimated to be between 47 to 21,000, nearly all of them women and children. According to the British Consul General at Smyrna, Francis Wary, 45,000 women and children were taken alive and then sold as slaves. Some of them, however, were later ransomed by their rich relatives. We have several chilling eyewitness accounts of the massacres, rapes, torture, and the fate of those taken What happened to?
Eleni, I think we lost the connection, but now it's back again. Do you want to continue? Yeah, you can continue.
Yeah?
Yeah, maybe it's easier. Maybe it's easier on the internet. Maybe it's easier not showing the images. Maybe it'll be better quality. I don't know if it's,
okay.
Yeah.
Let's try and see what happens. Anyway, Reverend Robert Walsh, the chaplain of the British Embassy at Constantinople at the time, gives us some of the most detailed descriptions of the fate of the slaves there. I will read to you a short passage of his account of just one of the several slave markets. It is as good as any picture. The first exposure was a number of poor girls of the age between 12 or 14 who were sold like cattle at an English fair. Several of them were without trousers or the necessary articles of dress. Terror and anxiety had so affected them that they exhibited the most deplorable picture of human suffering I ever beheld, and such as cannot be described. They were taken and handled with the roughness of butchers examining young cattle, and generally sold at the rate of 100 piastres or 31 sterling pounds per head. 500 were disposed of here in this way. Walsh also obviously thought that some of his English readers believed that the Greek women were easily reconciled to their being in a harem, so he adds, the horror and repugnance felt by the freeborn Greek women to slavery among the Turks under any modification is invincible, and they infinitely prefer death. Walsh noticed early on something which is also mentioned by various others later on, that is, that enslaved young girls or women were so ashamed after being so degraded that they felt, quote, they were not worth redeeming, since they would also disgrace their families. So when they asked, they refused to be ransomed. The Greek slave boys had an equally terrible fate. Many were compelled to convert. Every day, circumcision would be performed to about 50 boys at the same time in Constantinople, and the boys' moaning could be heard afterwards by passerbys of the houses where groups of them were left to recover. If any of the boys later reverted to Christianity, they would be immediately put to death. Other misfortunes fell upon those who refused conversion to Islam. Some were sent to serve in infamous public places akin to brothels, and others were publicly exposed in coffee houses and in khans. One of Walsh's friends told him that in one such a khan, a Greek boy had asked him to kill him to save him from his misery. Similar things happened to women and children in all slave markets. We have even more horrible accounts of women who were eventually ransomed or managed to escape. For example, a girl described that she was sold 40 times within the same day. Another killed herself to avoid marrying the Turk who had bought her, but her sister, who tells us the story, had her hand been cut off before was ransomed. All this became widely known to the people of Europe and the United States through books and newspapers, and helped boost the Philhellenic movement. Less well known, but with the same tragic results, was another massacre that took place in June 1821. The town of Kydonieis, the present-day Ivali, was completely destroyed. Kydonieis was a flourishing town on the coast of Asia Minor, just across from Lesbos. It was a self-governed, completely Greek town with a very important Greek school and a population of about 30,000 people. This town was burned to the ground. A considerable number of the population of this town flee, and Greeks of nearby villages fled also, and finally were saved by the Greek Navy. However, many others were killed or drowned, and the rest, women and children mostly, were taken as slaves. Francis Wary again wrote from Smyrna that in a town 35 miles away, Menemene, there was a slave market where thousands of Greek women from Didonias were sold. Others were being sold at various other cities of Asia Minor. In 1824, two major disasters took place, both on Aegean Islands. At the end of May, 45 Egyptian ships arrived at the island of Khasos in the Dodecanese. The subsequent pillage, massacre, and enslavement of women left the island desolate. Egyptian ships took 2,000 women to Alexandria, where they were sold. Less than a month later, another major catastrophe took place and left the island of Psara in the northern Aegean also completely desolate. Although small, Psara was the third strongest naval power in Greece. This new total destruction moved the people of Europe and America as much as the destruction of Chios did. About half of the 7,000 population of Psara escaped in their ships, but most of the women of the island were captured, although some of them were ransomed later. Even the consul of Russia was killed, along with the women and children he had tried to protect. Several women with their children jumped into the sea to avoid capture and drowned. Others died when the defenders of the fortress detonated the ammunition depot as soon as the Turks got there. Some other women who had tried to escape in rowing boats were killed. What happened in Missolonghi truly shook not only the Greeks, but also the Christian world at the time. The town had become quite well known because of Lord Byron's death there and the numerous references to it in books and newspapers. The long third siege of Missolonghi lasted with small intervals for about a year, between 1825 to 1826. The life of the besieged population during that time was as tragic as the outcome of their exodus was. The events at Mariupol now remind me very much the story of what happened in Missolonghi at the time. If you read it, you'll see why I compare this to the events at Mariupol. A rather small number of women and children had initially been sent to the Ionian Islands, not just for safety, but also in order to save on the limited food supplies during the siege. That's why they are so eager to send the population now away from Mariupol, because they have no food. The majority, however, of women remained in the town, and they actively helped in the construction of new bastions and repairing the walls that were damaged on a daily basis by shell fire of the enemies. When the Greek Navy failed to relieve the long siege, the population inside the town had reached the point of starvation. The fighters decided to attempt an organized exit, whatever the cost might have been, rather than surrender. Initially, it was suggested that they should kill all the women and children because the sortie would be more dangerous with them, and it was probably impossible anyway to survive. I have to say that it was not very unusual for men to kill their wives and children rather than to let them fall into the hands of the enemy, as women themselves also used to do. But this idea was strongly rejected by the local bishop. So it was decided that the sick, the wounded, and the elderly, and anyone who didn't wish to, would remain in the town and try to delay the enemy. The women and their children would follow the fighters, who would exit in 3 separate columns. Many women were dressed in men's clothing, since they preferred to be taken for men during the battle and be killed rather than be taken alive. For this reason, cross-dressing was not very uncommon for women if they were in a camp with the troops or were traveling alone. Long after Greece was free, an old woman died who had been among those who survived. She asked to be buried with men's clothing she wore during the Exodus. However, the sortie, the Exodus, as it became known, on the night of the 22nd of April, 1826, was a disaster because the plan had become known to the enemy. Most of the Thessaloniki garrison was killed, and from the women, just 14 survived, whereas others dared back to the town to save themselves. When the Egyptians entered Thessaloniki, the bishop and many of the remaining Greeks blew themselves up with the stored gunpowder. The rest were killed, and the women were taken as slaves. The exact number of women killed and or enslaved is once again not known. Foreign sources estimated that those who were taken as slaves were between 5,000 and 6,000 women. The fate of these captives has been described by various foreign authors. A number of them actually saw some of these women in the slave market of Methoni, a town of the southern Peloponnese, and in Ibrahim Pasha's camp. The women were first examined by doctors to establish whether they were virgins or not, and whether they had any disease. Then Ibrahim chose the prettiest, kept the ones he liked themselves, and the rest were given as gifts to his officials. Afterwards, many women and children were sold in the slave market of Methoni, while the rest were sent to slave markets in Egypt and to North Africa, in various countries there, sometimes with English boats, English ships. A young virgin could fetch 1,500 piastres at the time. Slaves could be ransomed, but it was a long and complicated process. In the first place, if they had been sold in a slave market, it was very difficult to locate where they were and to whom they had been sold. In the case of several successive sales, the task was even more difficult. It was a little easier when they were held by an official or someone else who had intended to secure ransoms or to make an exchange with prisoners held by the Greeks. However, the ransoms demanded were usually much higher than the selling prices in the slave markets, so it was nearly impossible for the majority of the families to ransom their relatives. Rich merchants from Chios were able to do that. We know the financial details of the ransom paid by Theodore Rallis, a rich merchant outside. He was in London at the time, I think, for his wife and 2 daughters. He paid altogether 30,000, near 40,000 piastres. The Greek government did not have the means to help much. In July 1824, the men of Psara petitioned the Greek parliament for money to ransom their women-folk and children. The petition was accepted, but only 10,000 piastres were provided to be shared between them, when the ransom asked for just the wife and the child of one of the captains was exactly that sum. A native of Psara, Ioannis Varvakis, a very rich merchant, Greek merchant emigrant in Russia, helped in ransoming many women of that island. Sometimes, even when the money was available, it took a very long time for the slaves to be freed by their masters or by those who supposedly friendly Turks had undertaken to protect the families. That was the case with the family of the well-known fighter Nikolaos Kasomoulis, a Turk, the so-called protector of members of his family in Thessaloniki, demanded 25,000 piastres to let them go. 7 years later, 1831, only his mother was released. The rest might have been freed later on. Greeks from various places kept on trying to find and ransom their lost relatives until 1837, as we learn from their applications to the Greek government listing the names of their missing relatives. We still got those catalogs of those missing people. After the fall of Missolonghi, the Philhellene Swiss banker Jean-Gabriel Lénard and the Greek committee of Zander ransomed several of the women of this town. These poor women, like so many others in similar situations, had nowhere to go. They had lost their families and any means of subsistence. A number of them remained at first at the refugee camp at Calamus. Others settled at Nafplion, then the capital of fighting Greece. But it was a small town lacking both accommodation and the proper hygienic conditions to accommodate the great influx of refugee population from all over Greece. Many families lived in extremely bad conditions, sometimes in nearby caves or in self-made huts. Lack of food was perhaps their most serious problem. It is known that some women and children died from starvation. Clothing was a scarcity as well. Many of these destitute women, however, submitted applications to the authorities describing their desperate situation or the services rendered either by their relatives or themselves in the war, and asked for a small pension. The government usually did give them one, but it lacked the means to offer a substantial help. Private American aid in 1827 greatly helped to feed and clothe the starving and half-naked Greek population of the Morea and of the nearby islands, which were full of refugees. It should be made clear that insufficient food was quite common for all Greeks due to the great reduction of agricultural production. The war often prevented any proper cultivation of the land and or the collection of the harvests, which were often taken by the enemy who had occupied the territory. From the early years of the revolution, the islands of Salamina and Aegina were the places where Athenian women mainly sought shelters, so did women from nearby regions. During the two sieges of the Acropolis of Athens, first in 1822 and then in the period between 1826 and 27, most Athenian women and children were transported to these islands for safety. Their move let the men fight without having to concern themselves about them. It saved on the food supplies of the besieged, which were scarce anyway. George Waddington, the Dean of Durham, a traveler at the time, attempted a kind of census with the help of the Greek clergy and the Austrian Council of Athens in 1824. Of the 11,500 people living in Salamina that year, the local people were just 192. At the time, most of the Athenians were already back in Athens, but all these refugees, about 11,000, were still remaining in Salamina without any means of living. During the lengthy second period of the siege of the Acropolis, and as the war continued in Attica, the Athenian women and children, once more refugees in Salamina, were living in such bad conditions that the acting bishop of Athens asked the inhabitants of Aegina to help them. The news became widely known, and fundraising for their support started among the other Greeks as well. Soon, over 3,000 piastres were collected for this help. Women and children also suffered during the second phase of the civil war in the Morea, when troops from Numilia moved in to help their friendly faction against the opponents. Then the shortage of food became even worse as irregular soldiers plundered the richer regions of the Morea. Some sources mention that there were attacks on the women as well as rapes, while others claim that rapes were actually rare because of the widespread superstition among the men that those who had committed such a crime would soon be killed in the battle. Rapes were extremely rare before the revolution, and they were severely punished, especially if the girl was a virgin. It was not always easy, however, to punish these crimes properly during the war, but at the very least, the man was obliged to marry his victim without any dowry, or alternatively, he would have to pay a very heavy fine as a compensation. Aside from their everyday chores, women also helped in the war effort. We know that they acted as couriers, messengers, and even spies. They carried food and ammunition for the soldiers to the camps. In some cases, in Athens, for example, they helped prepare the ammunition the men used. We have already mentioned how they all helped with the reinforcement of the walls during the siege of Missolonghi. They also fought. They did that to protect themselves during their flights on the mountains, as we have seen, but they also participated in battles, although they did not usually bear arms. There were, of course, exceptions, and certainly some women like Bouboulina had their own weapons, but commonly women went into battle carrying all kinds of domestic or farm tools, scythes, for example, or clubs, iron rods, and in their absence, stones and rocks. At the beginning of the revolution, there were not enough weapons even for the men, so those who without also had to fight with agricultural tools until they killed the Turk to get his weapons. That's how the women of Mani fought during the siege of Tripolitsa in 1821, and in 1826, that is without or with very few arms, when they bravely pushed back the Egyptians of Ibrahim Pasha, who had invaded Mani, and they successfully faced down sieges in their towers. Some women also carried arms during the exodus from Missolonghi, but that was a very special occasion. Only 2 women became famous, both in Greece and abroad at the time, and in Greece they still are. Laskarina Bouboulina and Madame Mavrogianni. They were depicted on stamps and on Greek coins and on banknotes before the euro. On the 30th of March 2018, a presidential degree posthumously conferred the honorary rank of the Rear Admiral, the Medal of Exceptional Acts, and the first-class War Cross to Bouboulina. It is commonly said that both Bouboulina and Manteau were members of the Philiki Eteria, the secret society of France, which organized the revolution. However, their names are not included in any of the surviving lists of the society members. Only one woman's name appears in those lists, that of Kyriaki Nafti. She was the wife of a medical doctor practicing in Smyrna, and her husband was a member of the Philiki Eteria. When Kyriaki found some of its secret documents her husband kept at home, it was agreed by the members of the Eteria to put her under oath and initiate her. Once this was done, Kyriaki paid the very high sum of 3,000 piastres as a contribution to the cause, since donations were obligatory for the new members. Bouboulina and Manteau had few things in common other than their patriotism and their distinguished and prosperous family background. There are several references to both of them from contemporary Greek and foreigners alike. Their portraits were published frequently in various publications, but these illustrations were mostly imaginary. Bouboulina was from Hydra and has been described correctly as rather homely and stout. She was middle-aged at that time and a widow after 2 marriages with wealthy ship owners from Spetses Island. She had 6 grown-up children, 3 from each of the 2 marriages, but 3 of her sons were killed during the war. Bouboulina had called after her second husband, was called after her second husband's surname. He was called Bouboulis, thus Bouboulina. She was intelligent and capable, and after being widowed, she proved to be a very good manager of the family fortune, which she considerably increased. In 1820, she had built a very expensive, very large 18-cannon ship called Agamemnon, which she used as her flagship. She also had 3 smaller ships. Bouboulina was at the siege of Tripolitsa, and she participated in several naval operations, for example, the blockade of Nafplion and of Monographs. Within a few years, she had spent all her fortune on her fleet. In 1825, she was killed in Spetses during a dispute with local family and not because of the war. The Greeks admired this, as they called her, manly woman, as they called her, and she was even described as unusual natural phenomenon. She was very popular in Europe, as her numerous imaginary portraits which survive show. Manto, short for Madeleine Mavrogeni, daughter of a rich merchant of Mykonos, was young, pretty, and well-educated. She spoke Italian and French, and she dressed in the European fashion. Also, she was single. Curiously enough, we don't have many details about her contribution to the war. There is a certificate written by Dimitris Psylandis stating that during the first 2 years of the revolution, she had funded a corps of 200 men to fight in the Morea. She had also funded 2 expeditions, one for a band of men to go and help Samos and another to go to Chios for the same purpose, but both were made under the cover of male relatives' names because she didn't want to upset her family. In October 1822, leading a band of men herself, she helped repel an attack on Mykonos by Algerian pirates. Her participation in an expedition to Charistos is uncertain, but she contributed 2,000 piastres towards its coast. Manteau wrote 2 letters, one to the ladies of England and the other to the ladies of France, to move their sympathies for the Greek cause. The letter to the French ladies was published at the end of the book, written about her by Jean Vier in 1825. She had a very unhappy love story with Dimitris Psylandis, who broke off their engagement. Then, feeling wronged and perhaps dishonored, she started a futile legal battle against him for breach of promise. She spent all her dowry and even she borrowed money to fund the war. She ended very poor and alone, surviving on a small pension. There were other women who also fought in the war, but they did not become famous outside Greece. Domna Visvizis, the wife of the Thracian captain Antonis Visvizis, was on board his ship along with their 5 children when he was killed during a naval operation in 1822. Immediately, she took over the command of the ship and its crew of 75 men and continued fighting. She kept on fighting for 2 more years until she ran out of means to support the operation of the ship, so she donated the ship to the Hydra's Navy. Afterwards, she lived with her children in poverty, petitioning the state for a small allowance. One of her sons, the 11-year-old Themistocles, was sent to study in France by the French Philhellenic Committee, along with a small number of other boys from maritime families. An even less well-known woman who distinguished herself in battles was Stavriana Savana, a 40-year-old widow and mother of 5 children, for money. She fought bravely with Kyriakoulis Mavromichalis' corps in Morea and in Roumeli. She took part in the siege of Tripolitsa and in the battles of Altetse, Trikopha, and Verga in money. In 1829, she petitioned the Argos National Assembly for a small pension for her participation in the war, which she was conferred by the attached signed certificates of several chieftains stating their participation in several battles. She was given a small pension and lived in great poverty all her long life. Foreign sources refer at length to a young female fighter and leader of a small band of men in the early years of the revolution. She was called Constantina, daughter of Zacharias Barbichiotis, the famous cleft of the Morea, who was killed in 1806 by the Turks. It is curious that she is not mentioned by her contemporary Greeks. In any case, Edward Blackyer, agent of the Hellenic Greek Committee of London, met her and wrote her story, adding that all her claims were verified by the local notable Georgios Isinis. Constantina had been wounded twice, first in the winter of 1822 and later in a battle at Patras. When Blackyer met her, she was recovering at Rostouni, a small town in northwestern Morea. Boukville, the well-known traveler and writer, also narrates Constantina's life, but in a romantic and rather fictional way. There were certainly many more anonymous women whose everyday fight for survival and freedom has not been recorded. A brief addition is necessary to acknowledge the contribution of a learned young lady, Evanthia Kairis, who used her writing as a weapon in the war. She was a sister of the scholar Theophilus Kairis, a teacher at the school of Kidonias. Since a very young age, Evanthia corresponded with Corais in Paris, and at his suggestion, she had translated 2 works on the education of the girls, one of which was published. Evanthia's letter to the Philhellenic ladies abroad was printed anonymously in Hydra in 1825, and it was undersigned by 39 other Greek women. This letter was translated in English and in French in 1826. During the revolution, people's private lives continued as before to the degree that the exceptional dire circumstances allowed. So marriages never stopped, even under very difficult circumstances. According to the traditional custom, arranged marriages were still the norm and a dowry still necessary. Kolokotronis' adjutant, commonly called Fotakos, claimed that despite all the hardships and dangers, Greeks kept marrying because they wanted to increase their numbers. At the time, marriages also became a very useful instrument in order to secure alliances or establish reconciliation between the families of the chieftains and or politicians. As a result, many arranged marriages took place for political purposes. I will mention just few as example. Kolokotronis arranged the marriage of his eldest son Panos to Bouboulina's daughter Eleni, thus linking his family with one of the most important families of the islands. When Panos was killed in the civil war, Bouboulina married off her widowed daughter to Theodorakis Grivas, a Roumelot general, establishing a bond with the Roumelot faction at the time. Kolokotronis also arranged the marriage of his second son, Ioannis, nicknamed Yeneos for his bravery, to Fotini Javela, sister of the Sulot general Kitsos Javelas. Alexandros Mavrokordatos brought his sister Ekaterini from Constantinople to give her in marriage to the politician and supporter of the English party, Spiridon Trikoupis. Traditionally, the notable families would intermarry, so would those of the chieftains. But a change to this general custom was introduced during the revolution. Marriages between chieftains' children with those of notables became rather common for political reasons, as you can understand. There were also marriages and engagement between Greek girls and foreign men, European Hellenes, volunteers, and travelers. What was completely new phenomenon was the marriages between Greek men and converted Muslim women. We don't know the actual extent of this phenomenon, but there have been at least 3 such cases of distinguished persons of the revolution who married Muslim girls who had been baptized. Divorces were not generally uncommon, although during the revolution, the new laws introduced early more secular character. The church continued to have not only the responsibility for the spiritual dissolution of the marriage, but in practice also the implementation of all family law divorces included. These were decided based on Byzantine laws, which remained state laws for about a decade. Women filed for divorces mostly on the grounds of abandonment, mistreatment and abuse, drunkenness, and for unsocial habits and behavior. Illegal marriages were easily dissolved by the church as they had been previously. The surviving official document showed that it was common for women to claim their rights in matters of dowry, inheritance, misappropriation of their money or property. Thanks God we have a lot of these legal documents at the archives. In the war years, the very strict social mores gradually began relaxing and unacceptable behaviors made an appearance. Adultery, however, which was not uncommon in the past, does not figure very highly in the divorce cases. What became rather common was that several chieftains lived openly with their lovers and occasionally took them along on their expeditions. Where such behavior became too ostentatious and provocative, like that of the politician Ioannis Koletis, it caused social disapproval, which was expressed in several of the memoirs of the contemporaries. Concubinage, previously unknown among the Greeks in the Ottoman Empire, made its appearance in mainland Greece at the time as well. Even a form of prostitution, more or less organized, something unheard of before in Greece, is described as taking place in Patras near the end of the revolution. Among all these changes, there was one truly positive development, the establishment of 2 schools for girls. In 1824, a school for girls was established on the Acropolis of Athens with the financial contribution and support of 4 Athenian monasteries, along with a separate school for boys. Athenian girls were initially enrolled in this school, which was named appropriately enough, Parthenon. They were housed in the Parthenon as a school. Parthenon was turned into a girls' school at the time. This school did not last long, unfortunately, because of the second siege of the Acropolis by the Turks in 1826. On the island of Syros, too, there was a school for both boys and girls before 1829. It was directed by German doctor Christian Ludwig Kork, a member of the American Missionary Society. We have seen how much Greek women and their families suffered. After nearly 10 years of war, only a small part of Greece was officially recognized as an independent and free state. It took more than a century to reach its present borders. The Greek women's lives gradually changed for the better, but this is another long story to be told at another time. Before closing, can we really say who the victims were and who were the fighters? As I personally see it, amidst all the misery and pain, the losses, the tragedies, and everyday hardship, all women proved to be the real fighters. Anonymous and eponymous, they all suffered one way or another, and they fought their own way, their own war, trying to survive with dignity along with their children. They fought for their religion, for their honor, and their country with whatever means they had, and for as long as they could, for about 10 years. Thank you. I hope I was not very tiresome, and I'm not sorry. I'm really sorry that I couldn't show you the rest of pictures. If you're not tired, we can try it again, but it depends on you. Of course, if you have any questions, I'm willing to answer.
I would say let's open it up for questions first, in case anyone might have to leave a little bit early. And then if we have time, we can go through some of the photos if you have time.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I first want to thank you because so many of the details that you've given for us have never ever been discussed or heard of. You know, some of the, I mean, not including all this incredible list of women that go beyond Bubulina, but also the very kind of detailed sort of an analysis of what were the repercussions of being caught, the issues of survival, and particularly this notion of refugees, which we think of the refugee crisis of the Asia Minor catastrophe, but very less frequently we think about the refugees of the Greek War. I mean, I know that with we've had a conversation a little bit earlier with George Tsitsekos about the neighborhood of Pronia in Nafplion, which is one of the few.
Yes, that was started as a refugee place.
Yeah, but that's one of the few places that has, at least even by name, a kind of a memory of the crisis of housing these displaced. I guess today we call them internally displaced peoples. Exactly. Yeah, thank you.
I want to ask you, if I may, you presented to us several numbers that to me, it's big numbers, 5,000, 15,000. Yeah. To what extent those numbers, based on your, research and your readings, they're accurate? And the reason for that is that in Chios, for example, to me, 45,000 people to be displaced is a huge number.
Sold, yes. They were sold, yes. Most of the women sold in Constantinople, those that were described by Walls, were from Chios. They kept selling women until much later. A lot of men, a lot of young boys were never recovered. Quite a lot of people were missing for years and years, and then they never reappeared. I've checked the numbers. They're not exact, but that's why I told you between 45 and 45,000 and 61. And there are several in between. Wary, who was a Turcophile, and his archive is now being studied after my suggestion. He had survived all his correspondence to the Levant Society, the English merchants of the time. And he tried to play down the bad things, but he also sent reports to the ambassador in Istanbul, whose correspondence still survives and has been partly presented. Theophilus Prousis from the States has published reports of all these, of that. Several have published various documents from that time. So we have estimates. We don't have enough because there was no way to have exact numbers. That's why I mostly say in between. Yeah. But if we say that the minimum number of the usual residents was 100,000 and not 120,000, and then remember remained about 2,000, to be exact 1,800, they say. There were a lot of abroad, but how many were abroad? Women and children were there. And since Chios was very rich, there were cultivators, there were merchants there were a lot of it. And the massacre stopped because the Valide Hanum, who had the to whom all the money from Chios went, intervened to stop the whole thing, because if everybody was killed or sold out to wherever, North Africa, she would lose all her income from Chios. Chios was very rich because of the masticha and because of other exports. So it still is a rich island. So the numbers are approximately correct.
Thank you.
And Einat, the Swiss banker, who estimated the women 5,000 to 6,000, the women from Missolonghi sold. He knew because he paid for several to be ransomed. So they are approximately, they're not exact numbers, but they're approximately correct. It was, and I have to add, since we're interested, because it's a very interesting fact, which I haven't included because it was already so long. When Kapodistrias started to negotiate through Progress for Osten, the exchange of prisoners between Ibrahim Pasha, and all the negotiations were done by foreign diplomats. And Progress for Osten, who wrote the history of the revolution later on, was one of them. So Kapodistrias had instructed him to try to exchange young women and young boys rather than older people or men, for demographical reasons. There were few women remaining and the population had fallen. So for demographical reasons, they needed young women and children. So that shows clearly what the real demographical problem there was at the time, because except the slaves and the dead, there were those who were starving, who were sick. There were sicknesses also, occasionally in various places. There was lack of food, so people died young. Since we are in the States, well, you can find it in the internet. There are accounts from the Americans who sent supplies, the Americans who fought as volunteers in Greece at the time. But there is one by Jonathan Miller, who was an absolutionist as well, who had also adopted a child, a young boy, who became, was the first Greek who became a congressman. Lucas Miltiadis Miller was the first Greek congressman. His second travel, Miller's second travel to Greece, was to bring supplies. And he describes the situation of the people who were starving, who were half naked. And it became, you know, something surrealistic to see, you know, people dressed half the Frankish, as they called, dress, and half of Greek clothing, and women, children were half naked. So it was a very complicated problem and demographical problem, serious demographical problem at the time, which has not been examined very well because we don't have accurate censuses. Kapodistrias made the census, but at the time, but under the circumstances, they could not be, you know, very accurate. But there was a demographical problem with the women and children. The children died. They had no food, they had no shelter. So it was really very serious. It's something that's not often discussed, but it was a very serious problem, really serious.
Thank you.
I feel very emotional about what I read and see in in Ukraine right now. They remind me all those various things, which if you read them, they're really dramatic.
And it's amazing we have sources from 1821 that give us that flavor. It's amazing.
Yes, well, you see, there are primary sources and secondary sources. We have lots of memoirs and stories by the protagonists, but these people, they were written later on, and these people had already a history which they had to defend. And as all secondary sources, they are reliable up to a point because most of them did not have documents. Philemon had collected documents, and some others had collected documents. So we do have documents among those things published as memoirs or histories of the time. Trikoupis had documents. But all secondary sources are more or less subjective. Now, we have documents, actual documents from the government, various governments, from private archives. They're not as many, they are many, but they're not as complete as we would like. But there has been a good job done the few last years. And if you connect to the Greek General Archives, they have digitized a big part of the Greek documents of that period. So when I was reading, most of the divorces I read them online because at the time it was pandemic. I just couldn't go. They're not so far away. I could go, but you can find them. And you can find them on the ecclesiastical part of the archive. So you can see them now. And local libraries and local archives, if have things that have survived, they publish them now. They digitize and publish them. But lots and lots have been lost. Lots and lots have been lost until it had become able to collect them. But still, we have enough to go. And now most modern Greek historians rely on documents more than the secondary sources. Though we're people who were on the field, or people who you can't disregard those things. You can't. Now there has been a thesis, a PhD thesis, which has been published, it's really very useful. In fact, I had thought of giving it as a subject to a student of mine, but I learned that it was already going on at the Athens University, so I didn't. And perhaps I would have dealt or guided the chap differently. But anyway, the new, the one that has been published is a good thesis, has been published recently in, I think, 2020 by one Vlachopoulos. And it examines the Neteria Zakynthou, which helped a lot during the war, the Chanda Committee, because they gave lots of funds and lots of help, and they were intermediate between the fighting Greeks and the English, and they participated in the whole thing of asking the British protection in that respect. So those were based on documents we had survived from Zander. And it's something new, and it's very useful. And there are documents of other people in various places. We don't have enough material from the north because there the destruction was such, and the archives, whatever archives there had been, were destroyed very early on. So we don't have lots of information. But still, things, keep accumulating. Now the digitization of manuscripts and documents has helped a lot in finding things out and working. Even during these 2 years that, in Greece, we were mostly at home. We were in quarantine. We couldn't go out. So we stayed at home and worked at home. That helped. So if any of you wants to look up documents, you can do it easily from your place in Philadelphia. I don't know if you managed to read them though. You might. They're not very difficult now. Writing is a bit different at the time. Many of the documents are, without uneducated people, lots of spelling mistakes, but it's good. It's getting dark here. It's midday for you, but it's
Yeah. Well, are there any more questions from anyone? Well,
I don't want to prolong this discussion.
No.
If you want to ask me, go ahead and do it.
Are there sources that are coming for your work that are coming from the Turks?
Yes, there are. But we've got some good Ottomanists. How do you call them? Ottomanists nowadays, and bit by bit, archives are open, or they were, I don't know, because at some point you were not sure whether you can work or not. You had a colleague at the University of Corfu, who is an Ottomanist, now has moved to Athens. But at the time, he wanted to work in the presidential archive in Constantinople. And he had taken permission because it's not as if you're coming here. You don't need any permission, you go there, you enroll. So he was given permission. He traveled from Corfu to Polis, went there, he worked one day, and then he said, no, you can't work anymore, sent him away. So it all depends. That was about 10 or 12 years ago, but recently, a Turk who I think stays mostly in Greece rather than in Turkey has published a part of the archives, Ottoman archives, which is very useful because he has published them in transliteration and in translation, in English translation. And if you care, I can send to Kostis the name of the book, which is very useful. Bit by bit, things are coming out. I've presented a paper, it's last September, in the Center for Asia Minor Studies in Athens, in which I'm a member of the governing body, and they had a small conference on that. And I was talking about whatever has been published so far about and what we know so far through those publications about what happened in Asia Minor during the War of Independence. And I used this book, and I also used another book which was published last year, which was from the French archives, a 2-volume work, which was published by the Piraeus Bank, which has a cultural institute as well, where reports from which were sent to the French archives at the time. So bit by bit, archival things come out, but I ended up at this paper saying that there are so many things we don't know. Perhaps the one I mentioned about the slave markets. We know about the slave markets through the Greeks and all the other foreigners who had connections, the ambassadors, the consuls, travelers, volunteers. Nothing has been published. Nothing has been published. So we'll have a secondary sources saying, you know, they were sold in Menemene, they were sold in Prusa, they were sold in whatever. I would very much like to know what was happening there, but it is difficult. I hope they won't send people away now. And the Greek Ottomanists could work. We have 3 very good ones in the University of Crete. We have a she's the president right now of the Department of History in Corfu. We have this Konortas chap who moved from Corfu to in Athens. So we have others in Salonika. We have Ottomanists. The problem is it's not always easy to work in the archives then. It's not as easy as we might have supposed in West. So things will change, but you know, they are useful. For example, this archive I mentioned published by the Turk, they have accounts of how people from Kidonias who were refugees in Greece at the time, after some years asked to go back and reestablish their town. And they eventually started going back under the Turks because the conditions in Greece were so bad, and they still loved their country. They were born there, they had been raised there, and they went back to Ivali. And once I had been to Ivali, and you know, when people, Turks now, realized that we were talking Greek with my husband, spoke to me in, are you Greek? But this Elinas. They still, because now they have Turko-Kritiki. Kritiki had been moved to Ivali, among other places, and they have retained the Greek language. And when this colleague of ours, the one I mentioned before, who is now in Athens, had been there and had been in, not in Ivali, but in another town. And there was a Turkish woman with a baby, and asked her in Turkish, what's the baby's name, the boy's name? And she replied in Greek, Suleimanati, with a Cretan pronunciation. Suleimanati. So, and once we were in another town in the interior of Asia Minor, and we've taken students there. We're going around, and there was a man who understood. He was not very old. He was about our age, but obviously his parents or his grandparents were those who had been living in Greece and had moved in Asia Minor with the exchange of population. And he couldn't speak Greek, but he could understand Greek. And he asked, Greek? Έλληνας? We said, yes, Έλληνας. Μας έδειξε το σπίτι που ζούσε, γιατί είχε μια επιγραφή ελληνική. Ένα σπίτι των αρχών του 20ου αιώνα, τέλος του, δεν θυμάμαι τώρα ακριβώς, να έχω φωτογραφία. Και μας έδειξε αυτό και μετά καταλάβαμε, άντε πώς μιλάγαμε, ότι ήταν από τη Μακεδονία, ότι τους έφεραν εκεί, ότι δεν θέλανε να φύγουν. Τέτοια πολλά ακούστη όταν πας προς τα μέσα, προς την Καπαδοκία, αυτές τους ακούς και αυτούς δεν θέλανε να φύγουν. Και όταν βλέπουν Έλληνες και πάνε, τους πιάνουν την κουβέντα, προσπαθούν δηλαδή, γιατί δεν ξέρουν ότι έχουν ακούσει από τους παππούδες τους, ας πούμε, και γίνεται μια κουβέντα, ξέρετε. Τέτοια. Δηλαδή θέλω να πω, είναι πολύ θλιβερό για όλους. Είναι πράγματα πολύ θλιβερά για όλους. Πολύ θλιβερά και ζωντανά ακόμη, ξέρετε. Ζωντανά ακόμη, ξέρετε. Είναι πολύ συνταρακτικό, θα το βλέπετε ίσως και εσείς στην Αμερική, με τους Πόντιους. Οι Πόντιοι διατηρούν τόσο πολύ την κληρονομιά τους, που είναι αφάνταστο, τους χαίρομαι πάρα πολύ. Όπου και να είναι. Οι Πόντιοι πάρα πολύ, και τη γλώσσα και τα ήθη και τα έθιμα και όλα αυτά. Να είναι καλά και η διασπορά της Αμερικής, γιατί μας δίνει κουράγιο, γιατί βλέπουμε και πράγματα εδώ που δεν μας αρέσουν, και το έλεγα πριν στον Κωστή και το έχω πει και σε άλλους φίλους Ελληνοαμερικάνους που έχουμε, γιατί έχω και εγώ οικογένεια στον Καναδά, λίγη έχει απομείνει ακόμη, οι οποίοι κρατούν τα έθιμα, και οι ξαδέρφοι μου μάλιστα είναι και σε ένα, χορεύουν ελληνικούς χορούς. Και μου λέει μια φορά είχε έρθει στο Σιάτλ και χορεύανε οι Ελληνοκαναδοί στην εκκλησία στο Σιάτλ και από τους Ελληνοαμερικάνους. Και αυτό λέω, ας είναι καλά οι Έλληνες της Διασποράς όπου και να είναι, γιατί κρατάνε τον ελληνισμό πιο καλά από ό,τι εμείς εδώ. Είναι πολύ συγκινητικό. Εγώ έχω να το λέω αυτό, όπου πήγα. Έχω να το λέω. Να είστε καλά λοιπόν και να συνεχίσετε έτσι. Να μας ξεχνάτε, γιατί δίνετε παράδειγμα. Τώρα γίνεται στις 12 Απριλίου ένα συνέδριο που το οργανώνει το Ινστιτούτο Μέτιτσι της Φλωρεντίας και το Γενικό Συμβούλιο Ελληνικής Διασποράς, δεν ξέρω, γίνεται στις 12 Απριλίου και εγώ θα μιλήσω εκεί για το αντίθετο. Θα μιλήσω για τους πρώτους Έλληνες που πήγαν στην Αγγλία. Ο πρώτος ήταν αρχαίος, Ιθέας. Αυτά.
Ωραία, ευχαριστούμε πολύ. I think in this note, I think, well, we want to thank you for spending so much time, and
my long talk, bearing so bravely my long talk.
It was brilliant. Thank you. We will share it with others as they watch it.
Yes, I hope so. I hope so, and I hope we'll keep in touch.
We will definitely keep in touch.
And all the best. Καλό Πάσχα.
Επίσης.
Πάσχα με υγεία πρώτα απ' όλα, να ξεχάσουμε και την πανδημία και να γυρίσουμε στα σχολιά μας και στις εκκλησίες μας. Σας χαιρετώ όλους με αγάπη.
Γεια σας, καλό βράδυ.
Γεια σας,
καλό βράδυ.
Yeah.